Hi, folks. Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational next economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I am thrilled to be here today with one of my personal heroes, Brock Dolman. Welcome, Brock.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm super happy to be on the podcast with you.
Just to dive right in, I'd love it if you could just share your personal story. I think just as context for listeners, Brock might be dissimilar from some of the other guests who have been sharing about impact investing, enterprise development, and so forth with his personal experience. But I promise you, we're going to weave this together. And so you'll come away with seeing how Brock's work and the things he's thinking about and developing tie directly into all the themes that we've covered on this podcast. Brock, take it away. If you could share your story, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, thanks, Kevin. I mean, first of all, hi, everybody out there in podcast land. I'm speaking to you from Western Sonoma County in the little town above Occidental, California. And I live on the 80 acres here and work for the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, which is next year's our 25th anniversary as a nonprofit. And we and I co-direct our Water Institute and with Kate Lundquist, and I co-direct our permaculture design, resilient community design program with Kendall Dunnigan, and we have a wildlands restoration program with Jim Coleman that are my primary programs. But I'm, by way of personal story, I'm a biologist by birth. Always grew up just out in natural places and fishing, chasing frogs and snakes, and just loving the relationship of landscapes and people and in landscapes, and went to college, UC Santa Cruz, did a double major in agroecology and conservation biology. And that really led me to permaculture as a design method for regenerative human settlements that were based on natural patterns and processes. And so really trying to bring a sense of ecological literacy, functional literacy with respect to flows, of the fact that energy cycles on this planet and matter flows and life webs. And how do we bring in alignment our human settlement practices, urban, rural, suburban, agriculture, rangeland, forestry, the types of things we as humans generally do and manipulate on the planet. How do we bring those more in alignment with how natural flows and processes work so that we can leverage those landscapes, not in a negative way, but collaboratively and in a good way. So a lot of that, I think, I'm interested in reclaiming the eco part of economics, of oikosnomia, really meaning household management, from ecology, the study of home, and recognizing that flows of currency, legal tender, is one material flow in relationship that we as humans have with each other and with the broader natural world. And how do we acknowledge and manage a whole bunch of budgets the carbon budget, I think these days gets a lot of attention with respect to, various climate change issues and the excess of carbon in the atmosphere and the ocean, for instance, but water budgets and soil budgets and biodiversity budgets and social justice budgets, if you will, not to really. So what connecting and maybe acknowledging and honoring that, that there may be a perception of, quote, profit, but when we look at natural systems, the profit in a forest is clean water and clean air and the buildup of carbon and, leaf litter and resiliency in a landscape that is more moist and cool and conducive for rainfall and that kind of stuff. So how do we mimic that in our social human built infrastructure?
You mentioned the Water Institute, and I know a lot of your work kind of revolves around water. Sometimes when you tell your story, I've heard you reflect on, maybe it's your experience as a conservation biologist, where you've drawn this connection between life and water. I'm wondering if you can elaborate why listeners, what's important about water? I mean, obviously we're addicted to it. We need it. But tell us a little bit about water and how that impacts your work.
Yeah. Well, I've definitely been accused of having water on the brain, which is, maybe for the listeners, I mean, here's the thought experiment, which is, let's get clear that you don't actually live on planet Earth. You live on planet water, to really use a phrase that Lynn Margulis coined many years ago, who, look her up, one of the most amazing biologists ever. And so when we're looking out in the universe, in our own solar system out there, the presence of water, especially liquid water, in the universe and in the solar system, like all the fantasy about the moon right now and Mars, water's and especially liquid water is the Jacques Cousteau, basically, to paraphrase him, said basically the water cycle and the life cycle are the same cycle. And while we're carbon-based life on this planet as we know it, meaning organic life, carbon-based life, the atom of life is carbon, the molecule of life is water. And so by volume, all life forms, when they're actively alive, are mostly by volume water. And the quantity and quality of water and the cycling of water through watersheds and ecosystems and the atmosphere and the ocean and living organisms being a part of that water cycle, and you drinking water and sweating water and excreting water in various paths, is all part of the fact that, life, no water, no life. It's pretty simply that way. And then unfortunately, when we look at the legacy and the modern moment of how it is that the water cycles and watersheds and impact of water quality are expressing themselves on the planet, it's pretty clear we're our collective human experiment here, project here, is not doing a very good job at supporting the water cycle and balancing water budgets on the planet. And so there's a phrase, this Dr. Luna Leopold, who was a professor out of Berkeley, passed some years ago, Aldo Leopold's son, for instance. A great phrase I like a lot of his is that the health of our waters is the principal measure of how we live on the land. And having water as a benchmark or as something to evaluate the efficacy of our settlement in place over time. So are you willing to get on your hands and knees and drink straight out of any creek wherever you live or not? And if the answer is no, which for most people these days it's no, spelled N-O, then I think you need to know, K-N-O-W, a different reality on that, because that's a severe indictment on the legacy of our abuse and misuse of water. And to be a little political in the moment, because here we are on December 12th, 2018, and the fact that the Trump administration is now, as of a couple of days ago, removing the various protections for the waters of the U.S. and that whole issue, and millions and millions of acres of wetlands and supposed disconnected waters of the U.S. are going to have protections removed from them. And that's kind of like thinking about the big river that's navigable is what we're going to protect, which is like saying, okay, I'm going to protect your aorta, the big veins and arteries, but actually the capillaries and the muscle mass and the tissue of your body is we're not going to protect. And in a watershed, most of the surface of a watershed is in the analogous capillaries and the small drainages, the seasonal drainages, the wetlands. It's not actually in the main stem of the river where you can take a boat on. And so it's the hydro illiteracy of that decision right now. Well, let's just say it's, I think we're going to be up a creek without a paddle.
And so if, as water is the limiting factor to life, every aspect of the economy, how we grow food, how we build homes, how we provide for garments or textiles, or every aspect of goods and the way we meet each other with services to meet human needs really impacts the water cycle on some level. And I'm not sure that all organizations and enterprises who are in the endeavor of providing for humans and our needs are kind of acutely aware of the importance of that. And it's obviously this connection of life and water. We're seeing it even very self-evidently in climate change and global warming. I'm wondering, you've painted some beautiful pictures and used some amazing analogies that I've benefited from to help understand what's going on with global warming in this very confusing and frightening time for people who are kind of just growing their ecological literacy. I'm wondering if you could share kind of the connections between the hydrologic cycle and what we're seeing with global warming, the impacts of climate change. I benefit greatly from your understanding of that.
Sure. Yeah, this is if we're willing to buy into this idea that we live on planet water and 70% of the surface of this planet is liquid water, meaning the oceans, and then you look at the amount of fresh water and vegetation and the glaciers and the poles. And what's really cool about water is this amazing thing, is this often referred to it as the Mickey Mouse molecule, right? Because you got the oxygen and then the two hydrogens attached to that, the H2O, and then how they connect up with each other molecularly so that water can be a solid, it can be a liquid, and it can be a vapor. And the thermodynamics, the energy exchange that's required to move the phase state of the water molecule, say from up solid to the liquid or from the liquid to the vapor, is there's an amount of energy that's either released or absorbed in that phase state change. And I think everybody knows that when you melt an ice cube on your forehead, that solid going to liquid is a cooling reaction. It absorbs energy and you feel cooler. And when you go on a run and you sweat, your liquid sweat, as it evaporates to a vapor, you feel cooler, evaporative cooling and evapotranspiration with vegetation. So people intrinsically get that. So if you then pull back and think about the planet and this concept of a greenhouse effect, where the dominant greenhouse gas on the planet for 3 billion years plus has actually been H2O. H2O is the dominant greenhouse gas in a vapor state. And then we have some other additional gases that ebb and flow, and we've currently been increasing their predominance in the atmosphere, such as CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide and those kinds of gases, these anthropogenic greenhouse gases. So the greenhouse effect is an effect. It's a physical chemical effect. And if you increase the heat trapping capacity of the atmosphere, then we get to what is called global warming. The planet is warming because it's holding more of that solar energy in this atmospheric blanket, and that results in climates changing. So I like to support people in recognizing that that's a set of processes and flows, and that climate change and global warming aren't exchangeable euphemisms of which one just feels less bad to you. Climate change is a response. It's a reaction to a planet that's increasing in its heat retentive capacity. So what's interesting is that when you then read various reports from, say, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you look at some of the dominant expressions that they're, through their multiple data sets on many trajectories, what you'll find is the dominant expressions that they often quote about how we're witnessing climate change, changes in climate, changes in energy flow on the planet, they're almost always a water-based indicator. So we talk about the melting of the poles, or the Greenland ice sheet just got a bunch of the data here just not long ago about how the rate at which it's melting, and that fresh water melting and now hitting the ocean. And because fresh water is lighter than salt water, it's beginning to plug up the North Atlantic, which could affect the Gulf Stream. And then you think about, well, where does all that solid water that's melting, especially land-based ice versus sea pack ice, oh, that's going to the ocean. So then you get sea level rise. And then you get, oh, the oceans are increasing in their temperature on average, and warmer water has more energy in it. And so then you look at the various storm capacities of tornadoes and hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons and such. And you look at water where most of the CO2 doesn't stay in the atmosphere very long. It actually gets absorbed into the oceans. And then we're going to ocean acidification. And so what you look at is all the fundamental indicators of what are called climate change in response to global warming are water-based indicators. The drought to deluge, the fire to flood thing, we're seeing these catastrophic wildfires, and the relationship to the hydrologic cycle and the dryness due to lack of water in a drought, or a big rain year that grows a whole bunch of vegetation that then, so we witness that the water cycle is intrinsically related to the fire cycle because it's the air cycle that's messing up on Earth. And so I often think about earth, air, fire, and water connect to life. And elementally, we've got disequilibrium in the relationship of those keystone processes. And water is really the fundamental vehicle. And so when I think that's more recently, I know our tweet-loving president offered up this idea because it was cold back in DC a couple weeks ago. And so he had a nice all caps quote about whatever happened to global warming, because it happens to be cold in the back east. And that's, just tragically myopic and parochial, because it's called global warming, first of all. And if anyone's ever had a good fever, I don't know how many people, I had malaria when I lived and worked in the Amazon for some time in the 80s. If you've ever had a really good fever, you know that there are times when you're hot and you're sweating, and then there's also the time when you have those chills. And the fever part that goes from sweating and hot to chills is a classic expression of a really intense fever. And the planet is running what I call a fossil fuel fever right now. And that fever expresses itself in some places as excess heat and drought and hot and flushed. And in some places at times of the year, it expresses itself as a quote of chills. And this has to do a lot with, if people want to really get into the work of Dr. Jennifer Francis and others, called Arctic amplification. And that really talks about the jet stream and the differential of the temperature in the Arctic versus the tropics. And as the Arctic warms up, the decrease in the differential in temperature of cold in the north to warm tropics, which when that differential is greater, it keeps the jet stream pinned in tighter and moving faster. And as it decreases in its differential, it allows the jet stream to slow down, and the meander can get wider and wigglier. And what we witness a lot is that when they're having snowmageddon, so-called snowmageddon back east, the West Coast is often in a hot and dry period because there's a high pressure off the Pacific Ocean, or what was referred to as the ridiculously resilient ridge a couple years ago. And you imagine a river of that air and moisture, the jet stream, hitting a rock of high pressure on the Pacific and bouncing up, making Alaska get really hot, so they couldn't have the Iditarod race some years in a row. But it then gets cold, and it's like a waterfall of cold that then falls down over onto the East Coast. And it's the fact that, are you in the peak or the trough of a big sine wave? And the sine wave's just getting more erratic because of this relationship of the solid water, liquid water, Arctic poles and pack ice, and the ocean temperatures. And so, ultimately water's running the show on the planet with respect to how it's behaving. And we have to figure out how to mitigate worsening that, which is really what the various accords are trying to deal with on the mitigation side. And then there's the adaptation side, because as they just said the other day, it's like a speeding freight train, and it's picking up momentum, and global weirding is the new normal for the planet.
And so that's probably the one thing we can anticipate if we're prognosticating to the future is probably front row seats for the rest of our lives on extremism, whether we're on the ridge or in the vortex, in the heat or in the polar condition. It's extreme events and less predictability, less regularity. And our response. So I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is what, given that context, what's the response? How do we pacify our relationship with this? What do we do? What's the response? And maybe you can reflect on some of the work you're doing at the Water Institute, or in some of the work you've been doing with the permaculture programs at OAC or at OAC itself.
Yeah. Well, I think on the mitigation side, meaning we have to figure out how to back off on the fever-inducing emissions that we've got. And pretty clearly that's a global conundrum. And obviously some nations and their economies have a history of having contributed more to creating this problem from the get-go. So the overdeveloped supposed first world nations, especially the US and Europe, have the longest history of creating this setup. And now we know China and India and Brazil and other places are very quickly wanting to catch up. And their emissions, and the fact that 2018, the report a couple weeks ago, is about our global emissions went increasingly or increased. And with the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Accord and the current accord, the leave it in the ground movement, which is ultimately the most astute thing we can do right now, is we have to leave it in the ground. And yet, how do you go cold turkey on an addiction to a set of fossil fuels, the solid state of coal, the liquid state of natural gas, or the oil or the vapor state, if you will? How do we transition off of that? And that's a whole suite of behavior change and economic change and other forms of energy and renewables and people, solar and water and blah, blah, blah. And our food system, how do we transition our food system away from its addiction to petroleum? Because basically the fertilizers, the ammonia nitrate, the equipment, the transportation is all dependent. The green revolution is both dependent on the production side in agriculture and the water side to run all the electricity to make the pumps to irrigate all this food. So we've got a really big challenge ahead of us on that global side, which requires universal cooperation and collaboration and trust. And unfortunately, that doesn't appear to be, at least from the nation you and I are citizens of, being modeled very well in this current administration. So that leads me to, while those folks who have the capacity to work towards mitigation and treaties and big retrofits, I spend a lot of time, Oxford Ecology Center spend a lot of time, I think, on simultaneously supporting the mitigation side, but really enhancing the adaptation side. So to the degree that the erratic nature of these various cycles we've become dependent on is changing, when, say, for instance, in California, when we get a big rain event, one of those atmospheric rivers, have we patterned our watersheds and our cities and our agriculture and our rural communities to take the blessing and gift of that big income stream, if you will? So it's not like we get a steady salary in California. We're more like we're working on contract, and we get a couple big paychecks every once in a while, especially in the drought years. It's a few big storms that are making up the bulk of our, quote, average rainfall. And you either pattern the ability to slow it and spread it and sink it and store it and share it when that rainfall hits the landscape in a way, and do groundwater recharge and invest that into soil health and into vegetation and wetland systems, and bring back the beavers, because they're the best hydrological engineers who can figure out how to hold water and slow it and increase the recharge and reduce flooding. And actually those wetlands become carbon sequestration vehicles. So we get a double benefit of reducing atmospheric CO2 while we're creating living carbon-rich sponges that cleanse water and create habitat and benefits for us. So at the personal level, we have a publication people can download from oaec.org called Basins of Relations. And we framed several scales. So there was one is your personal home, indoor, what can you do to change your behavior and use less water? There's a bunch of ideas for that. Retrofitting your appliances, low flow everything, stop using water, turn off the tap when you brush your teeth. Those sorts of basic technological and behavioral changes. Outside of your home, can you maybe catch water off your roof and use that for irrigation instead of the city's water supply? Can you use gray water from your laundry and irrigate your plants out in the yard to offset your demand for water? Can you pattern your landscape to slow and spread sink water through rain gardens and recharge basins and that kind of system? Can you retrofit your landscape so it's not a water demanding landscape like a lawn? It becomes an edible landscape or native plant landscape that can be irrigated off of the rainfall on site and the gray water supplementation. So what can you do at your indoors and outdoors at your own home level? And then we scale it up to the neighborhood or the city level. And how do we think about stormwater management or alternative water harvesting strategies and water conservation strategies at a regional scale? The state gets to look at those scales at broader water boards and regional water board scales. And how do we retrofit agriculture's water footprint is a whole piece of work. I was involved for many years with a group here in California, the California Agriculture, the Food and Water Security. It's like a council, basically. We have a bunch of publications of really, let's dive into agriculture and rethink how soil health is done. Can we increase the carbon content of soils through addition of compost and cover crops and things and less tillage and maybe no-till, so that we increase the water holding capacity when it rains and we decrease the water demand capacity for irrigation and we produce a more nutrient-dense food that also is absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, so we can take the work of the AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, where we have a polluter pay pot of money in California, and reinvest a lot of that money into supporting the retrofit of California agriculture to be a carbon harvesting, water sequestering agriculture. And that work is best done in California right now by CalCAN, the California Climate and Agriculture Network. Renata Brillinger and Jeannie Merrill run. I would look up their website. Amazing work for California agriculture, which is, we know, the fruit nut basket of the planet. And when the drought is on in California, you see what happens to food supply and food security. So water, no food. And energy, the water energy nexus is a really important thing. So every power plant you know of on the planet, whether it's a nuclear plant, a natural gas fired plant, has to have water for the various cooling reactions it needs, or hydroelectric is obviously a water-based system. The manufacturer of wind towers requires a water footprint once the wind machine is up, although maybe it's an offshore wind and that's in out water. So every time you don't use a kilowatt of energy by either increasing the energy efficiency in your home by going to LED lights or energy efficient appliances, or turning the lights off, or increasing daylighting in your home, that kilowatt hour you didn't use from PG&E or wherever your energy comes from has a water footprint to it. How many gallons of water are required to produce a kilowatt hour for you? And if you were catching your own water on your roof with a gravity-fed system that used gray water on site, that you didn't need to pump water from another watershed, and you didn't need to send the water to be treated, and you went with a compost toilet where you stopped just doing what you do in water and did that in the carbon cycle, so you didn't even need a black water system, then we start getting into virtuous cycles where the return on investment by integrated systems, where the output of one part is an input to the other, and it starts looking more like how ecosystems resiliency works, is really the way of the future. And that's what I think systems thinking and permaculture as a design method that intrinsically links flows and connections. And the beauty of it is doing those kinds of retrofits. My experience where we live up here is life is more fun and it's tastier and it's more beautiful and you feel connected, and there's right livelihood and there's green jobs and people want to be involved in a restorative, regenerative relationship.
And so that sets the tone that there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, whether it's on the level of personal habit and behavior change in our individual lives, or in our families and communities or neighborhoods, and then as we organize and influence policies, or as entrepreneurs, the techniques and strategies that comprise that mosaic of opportunities and solutions to transform everything you mentioned, agriculture, everything down to toilets, compost toilets, it strikes me that there's just a current need for individuals and organizations either to transition from the business as usual approaches to meeting human needs for, say, sanitation or food production, and transition our practices to ones that are in that virtuous cycle. And that's either, again, through transition, or maybe it's through entrepreneurship and starting new ones. And I know you and I see some of that work happening in OAC and the Water Institute, and through your permaculture programs, all actually create and generate supportive both educational learning experiences as well as materials that you referenced as being available on the website. I am curious to return to what you just said about this idea of, by contributing to that virtuous cycle, that it actually feels better, that it brings us alive. I know you have a lot of insight on this because I've heard you share it before. A lot of people, when presented with maybe the excitement about all these opportunities, when they put where we're at in making, say, for example, compost toilets the norm, because it's part of that virtuous cycle, and noting that we're just so far from having that be the norm, and feeling the urgency of reading what's coming out of the National Climate Assessment or any of the documentation. There's just so much hurt, so much grief, so much to hold. I'm curious if you can share a little bit on personal resiliency, or maybe personal strategies that or things that you've seen work. It comes up a lot when we're talking to people when they are facing this uncertain future.
Yeah. No, often, work a lot in ecosystems, if you will, in the restoration of ecosystems. But I think I'm pretty clear with lots of other folks in recognizing that the work of the day is what I often refer to as ecosystem restoration. So what's the storyline of the ecosystem? And right now that story, let's just say there appears to be a lot of folks on this planet, ironically, in our nation who are less than happy. There's that classic every year since the 50s or so, folks were interviewed. Two questions. Do you have more things than you did last year? And are you happier than you were last year? And that curve is inversely correlated. People have more stuff and the happiness is going down. And so Kevin, I think it's a great question about how are we all holding the enormity and the intensity of this current moment in our personal lives and our family, and the feelings of witnessing what's happening to the planet and to people. And I think the work of this organization called Movement Generation, the Justice and Ecology Project out of the East Bay, they work a lot on this idea of just transition. And I really appreciate a phrase they have a lot, which is that transition is inevitable, but justice is not. And so the question is just us. And I think I've been blessed because my partner, Carrie Brady, who runs a program called Ecology of Awakening, works a lot with this process called somatic experiencing, the work of Peter Levine. And it's a body-based trauma work that really is about our neurophysiology and how we hold and work with trauma in a biological based way, which I really appreciate. And absolutely, we all have to find ways in which we can connect to ourselves and our source, and then be able to be resourced in ourselves so that we can then show up for the work of the day in our families and our communities and our watersheds on this planet. And so we often are trying to find that balance of inner and outer, if you will, resiliency. And lots of people have different ways they do that. And I think trying to find all of those ways, certainly feeling safe in your community and having access to clean water and good food and education and fulfilling personal relationships within your family and your community, and feeling connected to work that is larger than yourself, which is where I think a lot of the green economy, what's interesting about the folks who often I hear say that we can't afford to make the switch, what the people saying that are usually the ones that are currently profiteering off of the despoilment and the pollution, and they don't want to transition off of fossil fuels. But when you really do the math on a fully engaged social enterprise, enterprises, many plural, myriad, of reinvesting in communities and in water and food and energy and housing and transportation and all of that in ways that are regenerative. And the idea that we have such unemployment to me is amazing, because there's so much good work to be done. Just for instance, in the fire world right now, the management of watersheds from ridgeline to river mouth and urban, rural, suburban areas, to figure out how to rethink and retrofit the land use from devegetation management, for instance, and how we're working in a good way with forest management or grasslands or wildlands, the wildland urban interface, so that it's less flammable and more productive and more regenerative and improves water. And there's outputs and there's products that can be, I think, markets that can be developed from the so-called waste product. Waste is such a bad word. It's the outputs that are in an active relationship with living systems. There's creativity there in the entrepreneurial spirit to come up with a whole suite of new jobs. But unfortunately, we don't have, I think, the economic structure right now tends to is the subsidies and the support are going for the get big or get out mode. And we need to maybe tax the toxic a bit more and subsidize the sustainable a bit more and reinvest our perceived surplus into a whole socio-cultural justice-based green retrofit that will produce more jobs and healthier communities and more mitigation and adaptation to the fact that the erratic future we're facing needs to be rethought, and business as usual is giving us what we currently have right now. So I think that, yeah, for the entrepreneurial folks out there, there's just massive market opportunity to come up with creative, integrative, regenerative solutions if we're willing to really model and partner with life itself and living systems, because we live on planet water. It's the only known place in the entire universe where life is endemic, that life occurs. Life's an insane miracle. I'm a biologist. By definition, that means I study life, so I'm biased. I get it. I'm biased towards life. And anybody who's unbiased against life, maybe they should go to the moon and Mars with Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos as soon as they can and figure out how to manage the water budget on that frozen ice water that they think they found on the dark side of the moon. I would rather stay here and listen to Dark Side of the Moon, which is an album by Pink Floyd, to be honest with you.
So the enormity of the opportunity is there, and there are big structural and cultural retrofits that need to happen, no doubt. And the intersectionality, we can do both and throughout all this, at the different scales according to our agency and where we're at in our personal resiliency in our community. I'm wondering if, just to maybe last question, or one of the last questions, just kind of, if you could reflect on some of the projects, because you've seen some amazing things, you've participated, you've created a bunch of amazing things, literally all over the world, whether in Haiti or the Congo, through various programs that you've developed. I'm wondering if you could just share some examples, or it could be around here, local as well, but just some of the things that you're tracking that light you up, that you're inspired by. You mentioned Movement Generation doing amazing work. I mean, anything that comes to mind, I'd love to know what's lighting you up, because I imagine that the listeners on this podcast would also love to hear about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, first of all, my preference and our preference at Oxford Arts and Ecology Center is to try to use the first person pronoun, if you will. So in my experience when I did, or in our experience when we did. So we try to model and explore and demonstrate and make a lot of mistakes and then rethink and retool. And so all of these things that we were talking about, whether it's natural building and green building, or alternative energy, so-called photovoltaics, or grid intertie micro hydro systems, or gray water systems, roof water harvesting systems, seed saving, organic farming, consensus-based decision making, governance, recognition of, to be honest with you, the current state of white supremacy and patriarchy, and how we have to rethink and retrofit our social ecosystem around the enormity of the inclusivity. we work a lot with indigenous peoples, native folks. Where I live here and now is the sovereign territory of the Southern Pomo and Coast Miwok tribes. And those folks are thriving right now. They're called the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria. And we have a collaborative, respectful relationship with them that's of some form, if you will, of reparations and being in co-conspirators with indigenous peoples of place in a good way as well. And so I think when it gets down to, say, physical projects, I have worked with a number of our folks and communities in our community in West Sonoma County here over the years, last 20 years, of a little town called Bodega, for instance, which is just over the hill from Occidental towards the coast at Bodega Bay. And they had a water supply conundrum with the creek that was not ideal, and the creek function was not good for the fish, and the water quality wasn't good, and it was really expensive. And a group of us got together and said, hey, what about we catch water off your roof and store it in various tanks, and then you use that water in the summer for your landscape irrigation, or there's a 40,000 gallon tank on the volunteer fire department. And then some of the dairy operations started doing big tanks, big meaning 240,000 gallons upwards of 1.4 million gallon tanks. And for the most part now, that whole community in the summer is on water supply that was stored from winter rainwater that was in excess off the roof anyway, and the creek flows are improved and perennialized, and the coho, salmon, and steelhead are recovering. And everyone's happier with that, and the water security is better, and it's more affordable. So that's in place. It's already done. A lot of this work is not theoretical and science fiction. It's science fact. It's happening right now. Our beaver work, if you really get into what beavers can do for us, and we have a Bring Back the Beaver campaign and working with beavers in coastal communities for salmon recovery and mountain meadows, as we have less snowpack and more liquid runoff from our meadows, from our Sierra Nevada, for instance, which is the significant contributor to California's water supply, is Sierra snowpack that melts off the mountains. Those mountain meadows have been degraded and dehydrated over the years of abuse, and beavers can come back in and help us rehydrate and create the living sponge to store more water to improve the water supply portfolio and resiliency of California, while they're doing a bunch of other benefits like I mentioned earlier. And yet in California, we still have a sense by our own California Department of Fish and Wildlife that they're thought of as a non-native and a nuisance, and are actually classified in the code as a detrimental species. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And that doesn't mean that beavers are industrious little buggers with big teeth. And sure, they can maybe cut down some trees and their dams might inundate some water, behind their dams, but we have non-lethal ways to coexist with them so that we can collaborate with beavers to get the benefits of beavers and still have a ongoing work. So I think we're often trying to work at those different scales. We have a school garden teacher training program here that for the last 24 years through OAC, and have worked with hundreds and hundreds of schools around trying to support our public education system, especially K-8, and ecological literacy and the relationship of food systems, and getting kids engaged with a little bit of growing of their own food, and what does that mean, and what does seed saving look like, and nutrition education and that work. And that's an effort that's underway. And there's, as we well know, especially in the Bay Area, it's a very famous projects in the Bay Area of linking kids to curriculum. And we can do all of that through the standards and link to all the curriculum, and they can get the math and the social studies and the reading and the writing and the arithmetic through project-based learning to the multiple intelligences in school to empower youth with critical thinking skills that actually engender their capacity to be engaged in systems that their life may depend on in the future, and does right now. So we're involved in the policy work. We collaborate with a number of folks around trying to change gray water policy. We currently have an active compost toilet research project with the County of Sonoma as a partner, the County Health Department, and the Regional Water Board, and we're studying 3 different compost toilet models that are a little bit more commercial scale. We have UC Davis and Stanford folks on our committee with the process of really peer reviewing this and having rigor and science on our tests to verify the efficacy of our ability to take human waste and turn it into a pathogen, parasite-free organic material that we can then reinvest into soil health to grow plants that can sequester carbon while we preserve water quantity and water quality simultaneously. So, we're in the thick of that, and we're doing it, and we invite people to come to OAC, and you could use the compost toilet and make a donation that way to OAC if you want. We'll take your money as well. We'd love that. We need that. But we've got lots of ways for you to donate.
Come over and make a deposit.
Exactly.
And people can find out about OAC at oaec.org. And the Water Institute website is on that site, right? Is linked.
It is, yeah. Then it's //water. But you can go and on the OAC website, there's the links for the Water Institute or the permaculture program or the mother garden or the school garden training, the wildlands program. Yeah, we're all different programs within the overall Occidental Arts and Ecology Center umbrella.
Well, I'm really grateful, Brock, for the time you've taken to share with the Next Economy Now listeners. I think some of the takeaways for me are just reaffirmed in that there's an enormity of challenges for sure. But if we understand kind of both the causes of those challenges that humanity is facing, the potential solutions or opportunities to contribute to this big project that's larger than ourselves to have a resilient, thriving humanity, there's just so many ways to plug in at all different levels. So just so grateful for your insights. Is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners as a parting words?
No, other than just gratitude for you, Kevin, and all the work you all have been doing with Lift Economy and connecting folks, and especially people with the economic capacity to really be participatory members of the regenerative vision for a future that connects people to place and a planet in a harmonious relationship. So thank you for that work, for sure.
Definitely our pleasure. That's one of our ways to contribute to something larger than ourselves.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.